Welcome, everybody, to the League of Women Voters of the Deerfield, Lincolnshire area. We are hosting a program tonight on the subject of redistricting in Illinois. Our speaker is Paula Lawson, who is the League of Women Voters of Illinois issue specialist for redistricting. Paula is a longtime member of the League, starting out in Oak Park and more recently in Glencoe, and then the Glencoe League merged with the Glenview League, so she's now a member of the Glenview-Glencoe League. And Paula is a former League of Women Voters of Illinois state president from 2005 and 2009. So we really appreciate you being here, Paula, and we thank you for all your years of service to the League of Women Voters. So tell me when you want me to start your slides and we'll begin. Do you want me to start them right away?
Okay, sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, this is just a front screen. Again, as Rosemary said, I'm Paula Lawson, and I'm the redistricting issue specialist for the League of Women Voters of Illinois. And I've been working on redistricting since about 2010. Next slide. And this is briefly what we're going to be talking about. We'll talk a little bit about the 2020 census. We'll talk about Illinois redistricting rules and the 2021 process. Probably after that, we'll take a break for questions. We'll talk about the League of Women Voters of Illinois positions, what gerrymandering is, and probably take a break there and then go on to what the Fair Maps Amendment proposal is and other solutions. And then we'll have time to for questions, more questions. Next slide. Okay. So I think, as you all know, the census happens every 10 years. And 2020 was a census year. The census is important because it is the building block for resources and representation. So depending on how many people are in an area, they get more federal funding. So it's important for that, as well as for drawing map lines. Population data is used to draw political districts, and every person living in the US and US citizens abroad are counted. I think you all know last year, because of the COVID-19 pandemic, the counting was harder. Counting was the time was extended, and then the census data was out late. Usually it's out, full data is out in March or April. This year it wasn't till August. Yeah, August 12th. Okay, next slide. So we have our state constitution and some other legislation that determines how what the redistricting process is in Illinois. So the state legislature is charged with drawing the maps, lines, and then they send that to the governor. And the governor can either pass the bill or veto the legislation. If they don't adopt a plan by June 30th, then there's a provision for an 8-member backup commission to draw maps. This commission has 8 members. The legislative leaders each get to appoint two members. And then if that group does not draw a map, then it goes, each party gets to suggest a 9th member for the commission. Traditionally, the Secretary of State has pulled a name out of the hat, and whatever party wins that hat draw gets power to draw the maps. In Illinois, the criteria is that the maps need to be compact. They have to have contiguity. They have to be next to each other. You can't have part of a district over here and part of a district over there. And the House districts are nested in the Senate districts. By legislation, there was a Voting Rights Act, Illinois Voting Rights Act of 2011, which provided to create districts that are crossover districts, coalition or influence districts to allow for racial or language minority communities to elect the candidates of their choice. That 2011 legislation bill also provided for public hearings, each of the geographic areas of the state. So when they talk about 4 geographic areas of the state, those would be the state Supreme Court districts. And then each year following a federal decennial census, the maps get drawn. Okay, next slide. So this year was a year for the state legislature to draw maps. They started with the process in March, and they had over 40 subject matter hearings between March 17th and May 1st. And the topic that they were charged with was to talk about redistricting principles and requirements and the census and boundaries for legislative and state representative districts. The League of Women Voters submitted testimony at 2 of the hearings, one of the Senate Redistricting Committee and one of the House. And we had at least a dozen local leagues who also submitted testimony. And our primary points on that testimony was that we thought that responsibility for redistricting should be vested in an independent special commission. And we asked for opportunities to have the community to weigh in on map proposals before final votes were taken. So the House and Senate maps were drawn around May 21st. They held further hearings on May 25th and 26th. Part of the problem with those hearings was that the maps that we could look at just had broad outlines. They didn't put in like the block data. They didn't put in the really specific data that you need to know exactly where those lines were drawn. But the legislation, the information, that really specific information was put in on like May 27th, and the legislature passed the maps the next day. And then the governor signed it about a week later. And the League of Women Voters and other organizations we worked with opposed that legislation based on the fact that the legislature used American Community Survey data as opposed to census data, because the census data was not out yet. It undercounted the Illinois population by about 42,000, and we felt that those maps could violate the requirement of equal population. So those were the main problems, that the use of the American Community Service data and the lack of complete information so the public could know exactly what those proposed maps were. And I would also add that during those hearings, people did propose some maps aside from general testimony, and there was a coalition of Black, Latino, and Muslim groups that proposed a unity map. And as far as we know, the information was presented, but we do not think that the legislature ever took that information into consideration when they were drawing the maps. Next slide. So as we continue with our drawing our state legislative maps, the U.S. Census Bureau finally released the data that they really needed to draw the maps on August 12th. And they found that the ACS data that the legislature used really was not accurate enough. There were differences in population of roughly 30% between the smallest and the largest district. And that's the maximum, 3 times the maximum difference that's allowed. It's really only 10% difference in population and districts that's allowed. Also, Latino advocates had said that there were at least 120,000 Latino residents who were missed in the American Community Survey projections. The House and Senate redistricting committees had hearings August 25th to 29th. Again, they didn't present what changes they were interested in making in the maps when they convened those hearings. And then a couple of days later, on August 30th, those maps were proposed and they were passed by the legislature on August 31st. And I have the bill number there if you want to look it up. It's Senate Bill 927, Floor Amendment 2. The governor has not yet signed this legislation. So the problems were lack of openness and transparency, public not being able to comment on the final maps for changes. And these new maps supposedly actually provide fewer majority minority districts than the previous maps. I also wanted to note that the Mexican American Defense Education Fund and the Republican legislative leaders both filed lawsuits challenging the state maps drawn in May. They will have to revise those complaints based on the new maps that were just passed the end of August. But those were maps that said that the original complaint said that the maps did not follow the 14th Amendment equal protection guarantee of one person, one vote. Next slide. So right after, we'll stop for questions after this slide.
Okay.
So the congressional districts are not governed by anything in our state constitution. They're simply federal guidelines. So the state legislature is in charge of drawing the maps, and the governor can veto the maps that are presented to him. The criteria are that the districts have to be contiguous and compact, and there's no timing deadline. The congressional maps have not yet been presented. The census data was actually more critical for the congressional maps because there is a federal one person, one vote rule. So those districts have to be very close in population. And I think that the veto session this year is in October, and I would guess that that's when they'll pass those maps. So I just wondered if people have any questions at this point. Mary, do you have any questions from the chat?
Oh, there we go. Okay.
And does Harriet have any questions in the chat?
No, I don't.
Okay.
You know what, I'm unmuted. Are we clear that does everyone knows that we're talking about two different things here? The congressional would be our US representatives in the House of Representatives in Washington. And then the state legislature, we're talking about Illinois representatives and senators. Okay.
Okay, we can move on.
Move on. And people can put questions in the chat, and Mary and Harriet will be watching for them.
Okay, next slide.
Next slide.
Okay, so I think you're probably almost all veteran league members, and you know that the league always has a position before it works on any legislation. And I have the Illinois redistricting position here. And basically, this position was developed in the 1990s. So it has guidelines of what the redistricting process should be like. I highlighted a couple. The legislature should make information and related data available to all who wish to participate in the process. This time the legislature did have websites you could look at. They did not really provide data themselves. You had to kind of bring in your own information. They have to offer ample opportunities for expert testimony and public reaction to the proposed maps. Well, there was a lot of opportunity for testimony, but once there was a set of maps drawn, there was really no up and back and way to comment on those maps. And the results in the maps, which offer the voters a choice of candidates for election. So we'll talk about that a little bit later. Our position as far as the map drawing says they have to have population equity. They have to be drawn in compliance with the United States Voting Rights Act of 1965 and subsequent amendments, and be compact and contiguous. And the boundaries, we really talk about keeping towns and cities together, and really usually natural things like rivers or highways to kind of keep districts together. We also say that no district shall be drawn with the intent to favor a political party or incumbent legislator or congressman. Next slide. So this is the League of Women Voters US redistricting position, and this position was approved in 2016. So it's a little more current than our state position. And I put in red the spots that I have used when we have talked about having independent map legislation. So this position says responsibility for redistricting preferably should be vested in an independent special commission. And then it also has redistricting standards, and the ones relating to minority populations are a little bit more current than the state league position. So they should provide for effective representation of racial and language minorities, and for preservation and protection of communities of interest. So this position has been very helpful as we've been advocating. Next slide. I think Rosemary just asked me to talk about what gerrymandering is. And it's to divide a geographic area into voting districts in a way that gives one party an unfair advantage in elections. So, and two of the most common methods of gerrymandering are called packing and cracking. Next slide. So this is just defines what cracking is. It's when you split up a group of people so they're dispersed among different districts, and it dilutes their power to elect the candidates that they would prefer. Next slide. So, and then the opposite of that is packing. So map drawers cram certain groups of voters into as few districts as possible. So in this kind of illustration, if you look on the left side, you can see the district in the lower right corner. There's, I'm calling them pawns, 5 black pawns and 2 blue ones. So that would be, favor the black pawns. But the other 3 areas just favor are split. So you would have more open races in those areas. And then on the right, part of it's covered by the people on my screen, but there's 2 of those sections have more black pawns and 2 have more blue pawns. So in that respect, voters would have less choice. They've been drawn to favor in those couple districts, the blue pawns. So that's what happens. And I would say in our state legislature, there is political gerrymandering. Whatever party's in power tries to draw as many districts for their party as they can. Next slide. Okay, so what's wrong with the current process and why should we care? And I should, these slides look a little bit different because I've taken them from different presentations, and part of this is from a Change Illinois presentation, which is a coalition that we work with, part of a coalition we work with on redistricting. So in Illinois, part of the problem is that our elections for our state legislature are not competitive. In 2020, about half of the districts only had one person running in the general election. And more than 80% of the districts really were not competitive. Also, as I said before, whichever party's in control draws the districts for self-preservation and try to either protect incumbents or as many legislators of their party as they can. I think you may have heard that California in 2010 had an independent redistricting commission, which changed, which made their process more open for their state legislature. Before that, whichever political party was in power, packed minorities into certain districts. And after these maps were drawn, there were 9 more districts that elected minority lawmakers. And the interesting thing was that really the party balance stayed about the same, but there was a change in minority representation. So also we have a problem with transparency. Even though there were hearings, as I said before, there really doesn't seem like the legislature really took what the public said into account. Next slide. Okay, are there any questions about gerrymandering or whatever, our Illinois positions at this point? Okay, so we'll go on. So this is what we've been working on for the last decade, I would say, is a fair maps amendment. And that would use an independent commission to draw legislative districts. And there were citizens initiative drives in 2010, 2014, and 2016. Now, our state constitution has a very small provision for citizens initiatives, and they're only referred to the legislative article. And that's really, it's very narrow for Illinois. So in 2010, it was a new thing. We didn't have enough petition signatures. In 2014, there were enough signatures, but when they went to the State Board of Elections, they said there weren't enough valid signatures. Finally, in 2016, we had enough valid signatures, but of course, the amendment went through the courts, from the appellate to the state Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said that the amendment didn't meet the constitutional provisions of being structural and procedural. And the interesting thing about that was that the vote was 4-3. In our state Supreme Court, we have 4 Democrats and 3 Republicans. So that initiative did not get put on the ballot for the voters to decide on. And then, so since then, we have tried to get the legislature to put a constitutional amendment on the ballot. And there were attempts in 2018 and 2020 for that. Next slide. So in the last iteration of this amendment, The Supreme Court would have been the one, state Supreme Court have the jurisdiction over appointing the members to the independent commission. And there would have been 17 members, 7 Democrats, 7 Republicans, and 3 independents. Public hearings would have been required across the state. And for maps to be approved, 11 of the 17 commissioners would need to agree on the map. And this would have provided for both Democrats and Republicans and some independents on the commission to agree to the maps. Next slide. So fair maps, one of the things about fair maps is that it would provide for more equity for communities of color and language groups. In some of our, we talked about the requirements for drawing maps. So you have to have, the maps have to be contiguous and they have to be of equal population. But this would have put language in that made the requirements to draw maps to provide for majority minority districts farther up the ladder in the criteria in drawing maps. It also required the justices to pick people for the commission that reflected both racial and geographic diversity in Illinois. This next point, counting people where they live. Currently, prisoners in the past, as far as drawing legislative districts, have been counted in the jurisdiction where they're incarcerated. So this provision would provide for them to be counted in their home districts. Fortunately, the state did pass some legislation to provide for that. So now the prisoners are required, as far as drawing legislative districts, to be counted in their home districts. Legislation was passed in 2020, but it won't be in effect for this census. It's in effect for the 2030 after that census. We also, I think I mentioned this, we prioritize the Voting Rights Acts and minority and majority representation. And in this last iteration of the amendment, denested districts. Right now, we have 2 House districts nested within 1 Senate district. It would have removed that requirement. And I think the reasoning for that was to make it easier to draw some minority majority districts. Are there any questions about this at this point, Harriet or Mary?
I don't have any. I don't have any.
Okay. All right, next slide. So when we're talking about an independent commission, there were polls done by the Paul Simon Institute, and it found that 72% of Illinoisans would favor an independent commission. Also, in 2018 and 2020, we were able to get like 63% of state senators to sign on to the Fair Maps Amendment, which was enough to pass it out of the Senate. It only requires a 3/5 to pass it out, but the bill was not called by the Senate president for a vote. So next slide. Since, once we got past 2020, it was clear that we weren't going to be able to get a constitutional amendment on the ballot for voters to vote on to change our system. So this is what we concentrated on this past spring and summer. We asked that all of the map proposals would be released for public inspection. We asked for 2 weeks notice and broad publicity for future hearings, which didn't always happen. We asked them to provide a 2-week period between the introduction of map proposals and votes on proposals to provide for public feedback and lawmaker response. And as I mentioned before, that did not happen. The really final map once there was a final map proposal, it got voted on within 24 hours. And all map proposals should include compliance report that details how lawmakers have incorporated public feedback and adhered to federal and Illinois voting rights acts. And I don't think we saw a report of that sort. I did read the legislation that was passed, and it did talk about complying with the Voting Rights Act, but there really was no general report that went out to the public. Next slide. So these were things that we really asked people to do during the hearing process, to draw your own maps, testify at public hearings, and send letters to the editor. Next slide. These are some resources. We used representable.org. It had an easy way to draw if you wanted to draw your own maps, and you could actually submit them to the legislature. And Dave's redistricting app was another app. And I think Dave's redistricting also rates how good districts, has some provisions to rate how well districts are drawn. If you actually want to look at the maps, somebody from the Palatine League asked me, so you could look on the State Board of Elections website. I have under those two, the state representative district maps and boundary description shows our current maps that were drawn in 2011, and they're actually really easy to look at because you can actually see where the boundaries are. The new maps are up on the House and Senate redistricting committees websites. I have the addresses there, but those are much harder to determine exactly what's going on because they show different districts in blocks of color, and you can expand them, but it really doesn't show you exactly, it doesn't give street boundaries. And so it's more difficult to compare. Okay, next slide. And then I said, like, what's next? Well, our Illinois Redistricting Collaborative met on Tuesday. So we're talking about continuing public education throughout the next decade. And some of those things to keep in mind was how do the redistricting outcomes affect our communities, and what are legislative policy outcomes? Are there some, things that happen in the way, how policy comes out, or we can't affect policy because of the way our maps are drawn, and they haven't drawn them so specific districts have the power that they need. And then we're talking about legislative redistricting, having legislative changes. It seems like here it's really difficult to get a constitutional amendment through, but we did talk about a joint citizen and legislative committee. So that's just one of the ideas that would just be a state legislative bill. But at this point, we're not sure where we're going. So really now it's open to any thoughts, comments, questions that you have.
I'm gonna go ahead and copy some of those websites and put them in the chat while you're talking. Okay, so go ahead and you can call on Mary and Harriet.
Okay, yeah. Mary, do you have anything in the chat?
She's probably muted.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Harriet,
Harriet.
let's see.
The one I saw was, what is Change Illinois?
Okay. Change Illinois is a nonprofit organization that works on good government issues. They actually started around 2010, there was a group of people who had been involved in state government and active who worked on actually campaign finance, and they decided to formalize. And so they actually started an organization, but it had pretty powerful people in it who kind of really knew what they were doing politically. So so they've organized, I think right now they have 4 or 5 staff members or something about that. And one interesting thing that I didn't mention in here is they got money to support a city of Chicago redistricting commission. Now they had some experts review like 400 resumes, and they picked 13 people that were, lived in different areas of the city and represented diverse populations. And they are in the process of drawing a sample of Chicago ward maps. And I think they're called Chicago's Wards .org is what their website is. And they had public hearings. They've published their first set of maps, and they're getting reaction to that. And what they are hoping will happen is that they can have this map put on the ballot for the voters to vote on. And that can happen if 10 of the Chicago alder people vote to do it. So there's 50 aldermen, alderpersons, and if 10 vote, then that could be that map, and a map that the city council proposes could be on the ballot for people to vote on. So we'll see what happens with that. But it's a way of, they've really been open to hearing, public input and drawing maps to support different communities, including, Chinatown and Inglewood. Just there's all different diverse communities in the city.
I don't see any more questions.
I have a question.
Okay.
How many states have been able to have independent mapping succeed? And what kind of a situation does it take to make that a possibility?
There's probably a handful at this point. I know Arizona's one, California's one. I think, they've had them for at least 10 years. I think Ohio has a new one. Michigan has a new one. So we haven't seen what happened from them. And of course, in California, it was a citizens initiative that brought that about. It's really not, state legislators that are promoting that type of legislation. So
No surprise.
No surprise. Yeah. And they're really, then there's pushback on what happens, and they do get challenged. So, people always talk about, Iowa has, isn't the right word, but more like professional staff that draw their maps, but they don't have the same diversity and, in population, but there's an agreement that they draw their legislative and congressional maps. So it's relatively new, and there's probably about half a dozen states that have provisions. So, and we haven't seen too much of how it actually works.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Do we have any other questions? Does anybody have any ideas on how they think that, we should proceed?
I see somebody sent one directly to me. It was Sharon. She said, could any version of the ward map idea be possible at the state level?
I think if this works well, if there's somebody that is willing to fund it, I think there is a lot of fortunately, some of their meetings were in person and they were all virtual. So it's much easier to get around the state and get comments, but it still probably takes some money. You have to have there are some stipends for the people on the committee, and so it would take a little bit of funding, but I think maybe once this Chicago thing is done, it would be, it's totally, the Chicago Advisory Redistricting Committee. So it would be a totally advisory committee, and whether the state legislature would listen at all is a question. But I think if this one thing, succeeds, then it would be a possibility to do that.
Okay, I've got a couple of people are sending their questions to me instead of Mary and Harry.
Oh, okay.
I'll go ahead. And Campsey, who writes, I'm sorry if this was covered, but when will we know what the new maps will look like? Well, we've got two different groups we're talking about, the legislature and the US Congress, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. So the state Senate and state House maps are on the website. The governor has not signed him. I said, probably once the governor signs those maps, we'll know what the state legislative maps look like. I don't know what, if there are challenges from MALDIF, if they would succeed, but they haven't, they probably wouldn't make a big change in districts. And I would think it probably would not make a big change in our districts. And the congressional maps, I think we'll see them in October, because that's the veto session. And I think people have to start, they can start passing petitions in January for the June primary. I have to look up the date, but I would think they would be done this fall.
Says thank you.
Oh, and yeah, and the other thing is I didn't mention is that when we have a Democratic legislature and governor, so it makes it really easy for them to pass maps with those majorities. There have been years past where maybe we had a Republican governor and he would veto the state maps, and then it would go to the 8-member commission. But the last two, the redistricting in 2011 and this one, it's all Democrats in charge, and so we haven't had those contests or objections to maps that were drawn.
Oh, I have a question. So who has standing to bring suits against a map that seems unfair or, illegal?
I'm not an attorney, so I don't really know. I know that MALDIF has several times in the past. So I think they would have to prove that there are, groups, the Latino population has increased, that there were groups and that part was ignored or divided. So I think they have standing, and it would, have that. I think that's what has to be done. Unfortunately, I don't know too much about it.
So basically, a group that represents an identifiable group and then that has money.
And then it has money. And the Mexican American Legal Defense Education Fund, they do, they do have money. They have it's a national organization. And that's one of the things that they do. I mean, so I just mentioned them because they're the only ones aside from the state Republican leaders that, had a lawsuit. So, and I don't think, yeah, I mean, our Supreme Court has ruled that partisan gerrymandering is not something that they object to. So it's more, racial and minority majority gerrymandering.
Can you expand on that decision a little bit? People might be interested in that. That was just recently, wasn't it?
Yeah, and I should look it up. It's sorry.
Yeah, it was another state that someone had gotten a case up to the Supreme Court.
Right.
And it was complaining that the districts were drawn along partisan lines.
Right. And I'd have to, I can send you, I didn't go back and look at those. I'd have to send that to you and you could, send it to everybody else as to what the case is. But this Supreme Court has in other cases ruled gerrymandering against majority minority populations being illegal, but the partisan gerrymandering was not. So I can make myself a note, and I'm sure I have it in one of my issues committee.
That's all I need is the gist of it. It's you just shake your head. Well, listen, this is terrific. I'm going to unmute everybody, I think, because I would like to meet some of the people here that are not in the Deerfield League and say hello. So I'm going to, all of you participants now have the ability to unmute. And I'm going to make my view a gallery view here. And I want to say hi to everybody. Jan K writes, absolutely a terrific and accurate information, Paula. Thanks. Oh, thanks to us for presenting it. Well, we're happy to. That's the nice thing about Zoom. So